大家好，对不起，我的国语讲得不太好，所以我就用英文跟您讲话。I'm going to go ahead and use a PowerPoint, and I'm also going to share some videos with you today. And I'd like a very interactive conversation. So feel free to raise your hands, ask me questions. I have some slides I want to present to you, but I'm happy just to engage in conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and start my slides. Hopefully you can see that.
Yes, we can see that.
Great. I'm going to start presenting it. Okay. So you already know a little bit about me, and if you have more questions, I'm happy to talk to you more about my background. The talk today I'm going to be speaking is called Asian American Women on the Move, and I'll talk a little bit more about that particular title later in the talk. The subject of the matter is the 1977 National Women's Conference, and this was the first and only time that the federal government funded a meeting of women across the United States and also across 6 territories. This was a follow-up to the Mexico City United Nations Conference that was held in 1975, and women around the world came together and talked about a common agenda that crossed these multiple nations. For the 1977 conference, which was held in Houston, Texas, about 20,000 people attended. And because it was connected to the United Nations effort, there was international representation. There were 56 countries who came, representatives from 56 countries who came to Houston. Very interestingly, there were 2,000 elected delegates that were held in pre-conferences that were in every single state, but also, as I mentioned before, the 6 territories. And 3 of those territories are in the Pacific. This is Guam, American Samoa, and the Trust Territories, which is a location where the United States tested a number of nuclear weapons. There were also territories from the Caribbean, so Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and very interestingly, Washington, D.C., which does not have statehood, was also represented in the National Women's Conference. So you see a little bit of a disparity between the 2,000 delegates and the 20,000 attendees. Not everybody was coming from abroad. There were 18,000, 17,000, some women who just wanted to come. They came as observers. They wanted to participate and learn about the conference and experience the atmosphere that was happening at the time. This is a conference that was attended by 4 either current or former First Ladies. So Rosalind Carter, Betty Ford, Pat Nixon, and there's somebody else I'm blanking, Lady Bird Johnson. So this is, because it's an officially recognized conference, women that were connected to the White House were there to give recognition and to give attention to these issues that were being raised there. I became really interested in studying this particular conference for a variety of reasons. I have a book that's coming out this spring on Patsy Takemoto Mink. She was Japanese American, and I'll talk about her a little bit later, but she helped to authorize this conference. Also, there was a significant number of women of color. So African American women, Mexican American women, Latinx women, Asian American women, and Native American women. In fact, they came together and created what was called a Minority Women's Caucus statement, a caucus that issued its own statement that talked about the issues that crossed their different groups. And some people have pointed out that it's at this conference that the term women of color was first used. I'm a little skeptical of that claim, and other people have also said it was used before, but this particular conference was such a concrete expression of solidarity that perhaps that's one of the reasons why that story has been circulated. You see here in the picture, you have Rosalind Carter. This is Bella Abzug, who was the first Jewish American female representative elected to Congress from New York, and she was presiding over the entire conference. This is Barbara Jordan, who's an African-American legislator who was elected from Texas, and she was one of the keynote speakers of the conference. So before I continue on, I just want to give you a taste of what it was like to be in that convention center. This was held at the convention center in Houston, Texas. and a sense of energy and kind of political excitement about coming together to create a national agenda for women's issues. I'm going to stop sharing here and then reshare. Let's see. It's this one. Okay, I'm going to share a couple different excerpts, but this is just part of the, I think it was a television program about the conference.
A special report from Houston, Texas on the 1977 National Women's Conference.
Good evening. I'm Susan Caudill. Tonight, the National Women's Conference is history, a footnote, a chapter, or volumes we don't yet know. Houston turned out and upside down for more than 33,000 women and men who came to participate or to protest the conference. It began with the United Nations and International Women's Year, IWI. All member nations were asked to examine women's rights. In this country, a presidentially appointed commission with a $5 million appropriation and a congressional mandate, organized meetings in all 56 states and territories to shape the agenda and elect the delegates. Only in America has this unique experiment in democracy been tried on such a scale, with all the attendant warts and wonders of the process. After 4 days and sleepless...
I'm going to jump ahead into the program just to give you a taste of some of the speakers. And then I want to introduce the subject of my talk, which is to focus on the Asian American women who participate in this event.
Women are human. We are united on that. When our rights are limited, when our rights are violated, we need a domestic human rights program. This conference could be the beginning of such an effort which would be enhanced if we would not allow ourselves to be brainwashed by people who predict chaos for us and failure for us. Tell them they lie and move on. The cause of equal and human rights will reap what is sown. November 18 through November 21, 1977. What will you reap? What will you sow?
I'm going to show one more excerpt, but I just want to emphasize the words that Barbara Jordan said. So what will you reap? What will you sow, right? What will you plant? And then what will you reap? What will you harvest? What will be discussed at this conference to seed political inspiration for the future? And then what's going to come out of this particular conference? I mentioned before that there was a minority women's caucus that emerged at the conference. There were, I believe, 27 planks that were outlined to be voted on by all the delegates. And the minority women's plank was very simply stated and very vague. And so the women of color came together and they decided they're going to rewrite that plank. And what I find very interesting is that instead of writing one plank, they actually wrote four. One for African-American women, one for Chicana and Latino women, Latinx women, one for Asian American, and one for Native American women. And so each group, even as they came together, also articulated issues that were distinct for their various groups. And I just want to show you a little bit of that presentation by the Minority Women's Caucus. Some of you may know already Maxine Waters, who's a representative from the state of California. At the time, she was a political leader within California. She was elected to this California Assembly. And then she introduced the key person that first announced the Minority Women's Caucus statement, and that was Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King Jr.'s widow.
Madam Chairperson, I am Maxine Waters, delegate from the state of California. The United Minority Caucus of International Women's Year Conference 1977 moved to substitute the resolution on minority women as it is presented in the proposed plan of action. And we would like to substitute that as follows, Madam Chairperson.
Billy Masters, Delegate at Large from the state of California, Chair of the first National Indian Women's and Alaskan Natives Caucus formed here at the IWY. American Indian and Alaskan Native women have a relationship to Earth Mother and the Great Spirit, as well as a heritage based on the sovereignty of Indian peoples. The federal government should guarantee tribal rights, tribal sovereignty, honor existing treaties.
My name is Mariko T. I am a delegate from the state of California, and I am a spokesperson for the Asian Pacific American Women's Caucus. Asian Pacific American women are wrongly thought to be part of a model minority with few problems. This obscures our vulnerability due to language and cultural barriers, sweatshop work conditions with high health hazards, the particular problems of wives of U.S. servicemen, lack of access to accreditation and licensing because of immigrant status, and to many federally funded services.
I am Sandra Serrano Sul, President of Comisión Femenil Nacional.
If you're interested in watching more of the video, I highly recommend it. I'm happy to share the link, but I'm going to go back and talk a little bit more about my particular presentation. If I can find the buttons. Here we go. Just a quote to give you a sense of the overall significance of the conference. So Gloria Steinem is a very well-known feminist activist who helped to found Ms. Magazine. And she talks about how significant it was for this gathering to be held. It was held in 1977, but originally it was supposed to be held in 1976, which is the US bicentennial. So it was a very symbolic year, thinking about the 200 years history of the nation, to think about what has happened for women, what are the current status for women, and then what's the future for women. So I'd like to talk or focus a little bit more about the Asian American women who participated at the conference, the National Women's Conference. I'm writing a book that focuses both on Asian American and Pacific Islander women, but for today's talk, I'm just going to focus on the Asian American women. And they were involved in various ways, but one of the ways in which they were involved was to just even envision the conference, to create the political momentum for the conference to take place. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Some women also served and were appointed to serve on the National Commission to organize the conference. So for example, March Fong Yu, who was California State Secretary of State, she was appointed by President Ford to serve on the National Commission. Also, Rita Elway here, she's from the state of Washington. As you can tell, she's younger. I think she was recently graduated from college at the time. But when March Fong Yu stepped off the commission, Rita Elway was appointed in her place by President Carter. And then here, another way in which Asian American women might be involved was to be on the state organizing committee. So 56 organizing committees had to be formed. And the women who, when they met in the respective states, then women could also be elected to serve as delegates. And if they were not elected, some of them were also considered for appointment at large. As you might imagine, the election process within each state reflected the political dynamics within that state. And so a very conservative state like Mississippi elected an all-white delegation or mostly white delegation. And so the national commissioners then took corrective action. If they thought that there were some women who were overlooked at the state level in the election, they could also appoint people at large. So overall, there were 74 Asian American women who were elected and then 9 who were appointed at large. So Marika T, she was the person you just saw on the video screen. She's from California, and she was one of those elected delegates. You could also just go as an observer. And for those of you who might know her, Mitsui Yamada, she is a poet, Japanese-American poet, who has written about experiences of being in internment camp during World War II. She was one of those observers. She and her daughter were just very interested in what was going to happen, so they traveled to Houston to participate. And then once they were at the conference, some of the women helped to form the Minority Women's Caucus. And here's a picture, the bottom right, of some of those delegate members. And here again, you have here's Maxine Waters, here's Coretta Scott King. So I'm going to go back and talk a little bit about Patsy Mink and the ways in which she played a role in actually creating the conference. It was a really big uphill battle to argue that the federal government should pay for something like this. And initially, the request was for $10 million. Eventually, they received $5, but the request was for $10 million. They wanted to have conferences in 1977 and also 1987 to think about what has happened in that decade. And this was a theme that was inspired by the United Nations. They talked about International Women's Year, but they also talked about International Women's Decade. But this was a time where there was a financial retrenchment. There was also an increasingly conservative movement led by women who were arguing that they didn't want their federal tax dollars to be given to a feminist initiative. And there were also various male critics who didn't believe that women should be coming together to talk about politics. They ran into all sorts of obstacles to finally get what eventually amounted to $5 million. And they only passed by 1 vote in terms of appropriations. The overall idea of the conference received more votes, but to actually spend the money, it was only by 1 vote in the Senate. And here again, you have Pela Otsuk, here's Patsy Mink. They both played a really important role. And I really want to amplify Patsy Mink's role because she's oftentimes forgotten in US history. So how did she argue for the conference? First of all, Patsy Mink is from the state of Hawaii. And she really argued that even small states, like small geographical states, needed to have a minimum level of representation. Her colleague from Hawaii said, what about 2? Because that's the idea of the US Senate. You could have 2 representatives from each state. But she pointed out that even in small states, there is political diversity. There has to be a range of people who to represent them. And so she argued that there should at least be 10 representatives from places like Hawaii, like Connecticut, like Delaware, right? These kind of geographically small states. The overall numbers of each state vary depending on the population of the state. So, Minnesota, we'll talk about Minnesota in just a minute. California was the state with the largest number of delegations. It had 96 delegates because of the population of California. Something else that Patsy Mink really talked about was the importance of having territories represented at the National Women's Conference. I mentioned before there were 6 territories, and territories are remnants of American empire. Here you see a map of the Pacific. And I know it's a little bit small, but for each of these islands, there are dates as to when they become incorporated into the United States. So Hawaii, 1898, Guam, 1898, Philippines, 1898. There's some other dates, American Samoa, 1899. So historians often date the late 19th century, especially 1898, as a year in which the United States expands beyond the US continent. The United States goes to war with Spain over Cuba, over Puerto Rico. But then because the Spanish Empire also encompassed the Pacific, the United States also goes to war to supposedly free the Philippines from Spain, but then the Philippines then becomes a territory of the United States. And so all these places, they have unequal political status. They may be so-called protected by the United States. And in fact, the United States has a number of military stations throughout each of those islands. It's very key to the American sense of national security. But the people on those islands do not have the same political rights as those who are in the States. And so Mink was someone from Hawaii, which was a territory before it became the last state. And because of its location in the Pacific, she was very attuned to the ways in which other islands in the Pacific were or were not represented in the nation. And so she really argued that you needed to have money to have these pre-conferences to involve the territories as well as the states. And then finally, I have here, it's kind of a complicated phrase, but she really tried to help us understand what is the history of the United States and how does it connect to the National Women's Conference. And she points out in Hawaii, the last monarch was a queen, Queen Liliuokalani, and she was forcibly deposed by the United States with military and economic interests. And she held Queen Liliuokalani as an example of the ways in which Indigenous women took on leadership roles, that they had sovereign rights. They were royalty within their own nations, but they were deposed by the United States. And she points out that actually this is a similar history throughout the United States, that there were Indigenous peoples previously here before European colonization, and that this is a broader history that existed within the nation. But it's through arguments like these and the efforts of people like Patsy Mink that Congress actually passed the funding that led to the National Conference. Feel free to stop me or raise your hands or interrupt me if you have any questions about what I'm saying, and if you want me to clarify anything. I'm going to go forward for now, but feel free to just interrupt me if you have questions. So I just want to give you two quick snapshots of what it was like to have these state meetings and what the dynamics were like. I mentioned before, California had the largest delegation. There were 96 people who were elected from California, and there were 5 people who were listed as alternates. So this is what I'm doing research on with teams of faculty, students at UCI and UCSD and other campuses. We're doing biographical research on all the women who were elected as delegates from California. And California has the largest number of Asian American Pacific Islander delegates, although I don't think there were any Pacific Islander delegates. They were Asian American delegates who were coming from California. So Mariko T was one of them. I can tell you more about others later on in the talk, and if you have questions as well. It was both the largest delegation, and it was also the largest number of delegates from Asian Americans. And it was interesting when I was doing a quantitative count as to which states were sending Asian American representatives, delegates to the National Conference. California was definitely the largest, but the next tier were sort of the big epicenters of Asian American populations like New York, Washington, DC, Washington. So you can really see the demographics across the country by looking at the delegates who were elected. And overall, there were 19 states that elected Asian American delegates to the National Women's Conference. For other states that did not have delegates, there were still people who were involved in the state conference. So one of the people I became really interested in is Edith Yang, who is an architect, Chinese American architect, who's in the state of Oregon. And in fact, I think I might try to write about her next. But she was an architect in the beginning of the mid-20th century, at a time when very few women and certainly very few Chinese Americans are being involved in that particular profession. She was the staff architect for Oregon State University, and she also designed a number of civic buildings in Corvallis, which is where Oregon State is based. So just really amazing people that I had not really known about before. These are some of the issues that were defined by Asian Americans who participated in the state meetings and eventually went on to become delegates. So as you can tell from the statement, the population of Asian Americans are heavily immigrant. A number of them are not fluent in English, or English is their second language. And so they're very concerned about linguistic access, about government services, commercial services. How do we really fully become part of the United States, given these demographics, and what are the things that need to be changed so that they can gain full access? And very interestingly, Asian Americans wanted to be seen as a minority group that has similarities with other people of color. They were not trying to say that they were like white Americans. In fact, they were saying they were more similar to African Americans, American Indians, Mexican Americans, and Puerto Rican Americans. Just as a contrast to think about Minnesota, and actually, I really want to thank my uncle and aunt for hosting me a few years back to do research. I stayed at their home and I did research at the Minnesota Historical Center. And I had a chance to meet Gloria Kumagai, who was one of 2 Asian American delegates who were elected from the state of Minnesota. So you see her when she was younger, when she was elected. And then this is her when I interviewed her several years back. And this is the t-shirt that she has from the conference itself. So you see the phrase "Women on the Move" was a logo. And it harkens back to my talk title, Asian American on the Move. Right. So a very kind of white overall delegation, reflective of Minnesota's demographics. But there were efforts by Black, Latinx, American Indian women to come together along with Asian Americans. And they were actually efforts to write their interests and agenda items into the state delegation report so that those resolutions can then be passed on to the National Women's Conference. But very interestingly, there were no specific ones for Asian American Pacific Islander women. So in looking at the data overall, and I'm still doing research, I'm still studying and trying to think about how I want to talk about the conference. But here are some commonalities that I saw in looking at Asian American women's representation at the National Women's Conference. A number of them were oriented towards educational reform, and especially educational reform that recognize Asian American history and Asian American experiences in the educational curriculum. This was happening at the college level. So one of the delegates from Michigan was advocating for Asian American studies. So it was very interesting for her to be doing this in the late 70s. And actually, Gloria Kumagai herself, she was part of the educational K through 12 system in St. Paul. And so she was thinking about how to integrate this experiences of people of color, especially women of color, into the readings of public schools. So this is one of the big themes about education. And in fact, the educational affiliation for a number of the Asian American women helped explain where they were coming from. So for example, somebody from Delaware was based at the University of Delaware. There were some folks who were based in the American South, which I didn't expect to find, but they were part of the educational university systems there. One of the first Korean women in the United States who was involved in higher education, advocating for studies about the Korean diaspora, was coming out of places like Connecticut. So in these more isolated areas, the educational affiliations, and especially university affiliations of the delegates, made a big impact. Was there a comment or question? Okay, I'm going to go on to the next point. So the second main theme that I saw for the Asian American women, oh, go ahead. Okay. Oh, that's wonderful. So the other main theme that I found was that a number of the delegates were involved in community service and advocacy. So these are delegates from Orange County. Two of them are Asian American. Julia Gulagai is Filipina, and she helped found the first Asian Pacific American organization in Orange County, which is where I live. And what I found really interesting about her is that she's Filipina, but I think it was less recognized at that time. And so she kept on being confused with other ethnic groups. So when she was at the conference, someone interviewed her and said, "Are you Mexican American?" And she said, "No, I'm Filipina." But the person just kept on coming back to that question. Also, because Filipinos were the third largest Asian American group at that time. But Gloria was involved with a number of groups, including a Japanese American organization. So she was written as Japanese American later on in one of the sources I found. So she's someone who was in creating community-based organizations. She was advocating for affirmative action. She was trying to advocate for resources for the community. The other person that I have here, Mary Arimoto, she was based in Long Beach, and she helped found very important community organizations that were trying to help women who were married to US military servicemen. She was trying to respond to the influx of new immigrants and refugees from Southeast Asia as a result of the US war in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. She was also responding to the migration of Pacific Islanders, people from American Samoa, people from Guam. And so the fact that she was embedded in these communities, even though she herself is Japanese American, she was also trying to speak on behalf of the broader array of Asian American Pacific Islander communities that were starting to settle in places like California.
Judy, would you enlarge your slides so we don't have to see double image? We don't need to see notes. Or keeping the note for yourself. Give us the bigger image. You can see the whole picture of the slide. Can we just picture of your slide without two images there?
Let me see what I can do.
Yeah. Okay. Get the whole image, so we don't need to see two images there. A particular second image is for your own use. We don't need that one. Just show the bigger image of your slide. Yeah, okay, make the whole thing and take out the other one.
Yeah, I think there's a way for me to show this without showing you my notes, but I'm not sure. Is this better?
Yeah, this is better.
When you select screen sharing, you need to click like something like advanced tab on that window, and that allow you to just share an area of your screen instead of the whole thing.
Couldn't see your picture at all. It's already too crowded.
Yeah.
But I think right now we are good. The presentation is big rather than the other stuff there.
They're getting bigger and bigger. Yeah, that's okay. Make it bigger.
Is that better?
Can you make the whole thing? We don't need to see the other side of the screen.
Yeah, I think I have to go into presentation mode. And when I go into presentation mode, I think you see two. But let me try this again.
Okay, that's good.
Okay, yay. Okay, thanks for interrupting me. So I was just saying that these women are really involved in the community. And for Mary Arimoto, she was raising issues about mental health. She was raising issues about socioeconomic access, about education, about translation services. So very much providing services on the ground for people who desperately needed these services. I mentioned before she's Japanese American, and that was the largest group that was represented within the Asian American category among the delegates. And I think it reflects the fact that Japanese Americans, even though they were the second to arrive in the United States, there were larger numbers of women who were part of that immigration stream. And I can say more if you're interested. And so they were able to have a second and third generation by the time of the conference. A number of the women were actually second generation. A lot of people tend to associate the 60s and 70s, that kind of youth rebellion, with people under 30. But actually, a number of the delegates were in their 40s and 50s. So they had spent a number of years, decades, doing this type of very kind of on the grounds community work. And for Mary, there's something that was very powerful. Her family was interned during World War II. They were incarcerated by the US government on the assumption that anybody who's Japanese might be the enemy in the United States. And her family was Christian. One of the first places they were relocated to were these horse stalls, before they were relocated to concentration camps. And so her father was just trying to help them understand what was happening to them, and said, you know, Jesus started his life in a stable, and so can we. But you can just get a sense of how much they struggled throughout their life. And then for people like Mary Arimoto is to give back to the community by helping new immigrants as they arrive to help them get settled and adjusted. So I mentioned that education was a key theme. I mentioned community service and advocacy was another key theme. For me, a third key theme was government leadership. There's often the assumption that Asian Americans are not politically engaged, and that's the model minority representation of Asian Americans, that they work hard, they focus on education, they focus on their own family, and they get ahead. But a number of the delegates were already involved in some way with government advocacy. So Patsy Mink was the first woman of color to go into Congress, and I want to introduce Ying Lee. I don't know how many people have read Gus Lee's book, China Boy, but Gus Lee was her brother. And they were refugees from China during the Sino-Japanese War. And she talked about just experiencing the violence and poverty that resulted from war. She ended up growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, went to places like Berkeley when it was very inexpensive. She also went to City College in San Francisco. So she became really critical of war in general and was part of the anti-war movement during the 60s and 70s. She ran for the Berkeley City Council and was the first Asian American to be elected to the council, and was the only Asian American elected to the council until about 2018, when there was a slate of people who were elected. She only served 4 years, but she was trying to use her government position to find ways to address economic inequality. So for example, trying to think about, can utilities be collectively owned and managed, and could that be more an equitable way to provide necessary services to the community? I have not had a chance to interview her. I did interview her daughter, who's also very involved with community issues, and she went on to just have decades of activism. All these women have had decades of activism, like prior to the conference, but also after the conference. So you see her; she's wearing a sign, "Grandmothers Against War." This has to do with the Gulf War, I believe. She's also someone who supported Black Lives Matter, and she's still going. So I think she might be in her 80s or 90s. This is a series of oral histories that she did with a community historian. But she's exemplary of other Asian Americans who are in kind of similar positions. So yeah, they're running for office, they're serving on government commissions. And in some ways it makes sense in that this is a government authorized conference, that they would try to mobilize other women who are already involved in some way with government leadership. Oftentimes the 60s and 70s are associated, especially the 60s, with sort of revolutionary or radical forms of activism. But these women are trying to find ways to introduce important ideas that might seem revolutionary or radical, but they're trying to figure out how to access the existing system, existing political system or existing social service system, and try to transform those systems. So those are the three themes that I saw among the delegates who were being elected. I did want to talk a little bit about how they got elected. So on the one hand, some of these women were perceived as community leaders. So for example, Mary Arimoto, Gloria Julikai, they were perceived as community leaders. So the national commissioners would reach out to them and say, we want to mobilize a diverse constituency. Can you help us do that? Right? They're trying to reach out to local leaders who have these contacts, who can then bring women to the state meetings, involve them in the process. So that was one way in which some of these women became involved. They were invited, and based on their existing leadership skills and their track record. And then once they occupy a leadership position, for example, on the California State Commission, then it's much easier for them to be elected as delegates. They're already visible. They already have kind of legitimacy. The other way I think that Asian American women are being elected, it was just through their own initiative and especially their group mobilization. So various organizations, including the Organization of Chinese Americans and their kind of affiliate Organization of Chinese American Women, they contact women throughout their own state, throughout various states, to say, this event, this conference is happening. How can we have Chinese American representation at these gatherings? Or the Japanese American Citizens League was doing this among Japanese American women. So it wasn't just so much that other people had already recognized Asian American women as having leadership, but these organizations want to make sure that their voice was being heard in these particular platforms and settings. So I'm just going to wrap up. This is a really moving moment during the conference. It opened up like the Olympics. We just had the Olympics, but there was this torch that was run from Seneca Falls, which is considered the first convention on women's rights issues, and they ran the torch all the way to Houston, Texas. Some places it was a little dangerous. Some people were very opposed to the idea of the conference, and sometimes the local runners didn't want to participate. So they would actually, bring in people from the outside so they can run different legs of the conference. But eventually it culminated with a ceremonial run to the Houston Convention Center. And as you can tell, the organizers were very interested in representing a diversity among the US women. And I just wanted to end with a couple of quotes, right? We are here to move history forward. This is part of the official report from the conference. And Maya Angelou is an African-American writer who wrote a poem to start the conference, right? We promise to accept nothing less than justice for every woman. So let me stop here, and I'm happy to answer questions and engage with you in conversation. Okay.
Maybe I have a question here, Judy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Could you tell us what in the recent movement here with the Black movement and so on, how do they relate that to Asian American in recent months?
Yeah, I think it's both what the Black Lives Matter understands about the Asian American community and Asian American movement, but also how the Asian American community connects to Black Lives Matter. So I actually was part of a Zoom conversation by leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement that wanted to reach out to Asian American Pacific Islander community leaders. And they wanted to find ways that we could partner with one another, that we can support one another. But they also were very clear that the leadership had to come from the Black community, and that other racial groups can also play a role in supporting and advocating for what they're expressing, but that it should be a support role rather than a kind of co-leadership role. In terms of the ways in which the Asian American community connects with Black Lives Matter, I think a lot of people people who are maybe more progressive have talked about anti-Blackness within the Asian American community, right? Kind of negative attitudes towards Black people, negative attitudes towards Black communities, the ways in which we might reinforce racial hierarchy. And so people who want to address that have held various events to talk about this. So for example, in Irvine, I partner with a number of community organizations. We meet once a month. We call Meet and Eat because we used to actually meet in restaurants and eat together and talk. But I've really been inspired by the work that they do. So these are community-based organizations like the one I was describing by Mary Arimoto and Gloria Julagai. We collectively held a series of events that talked about anti-Blackness in the Asian American community. So one example was about colorism, right? The presumption that people who are paler and lighter are more beautiful or more desirable compared to those people who are darker. Or the attitudes about affirmative action, right? There's some Asian Americans who want to get rid of affirmative action, and others who argue that affirmative action is beneficial both to Asian Americans, but also to other racialized communities. So I think there's not a uniform response necessarily to Black Lives Matter within the Asian American community, but I think there are people who are sympathetic and want to promote some of those same arguments and goals, and others who are much more critical. You can also see this in terms of the riot that happened in Washington, D.C. There were some people who were displaying the South Vietnamese flag. There were some people displaying other kind of Asian country flags as part of that protest against, I guess, democracy, or trying to show their support for Trump. So I think overall, Asian American communities tend to vote more Democratic, but there's a very strong contingent that is also very conservative as well.
Okay, I have another question for you. Minnesota, we had this Hmong young lady. He won the gold medalist at gym, and seemed to be, you need some kind of hero or heroism to show the world. Can we do some promotion that so the Hmong lady could do something for the Asian American women?
Yeah, it's so exciting to see her win the gold medal and for her to play a leadership role on the U.S. gymnastics team. I know there was a lot of excitement about Simone Biles. And so it was really wonderful for Suni Lee to have kind of her place in the sun. And it's really wonderful. I haven't seen that much coverage about her, but I know she really wanted to proclaim pride in her Hmong community. And I think she herself is multiracial, right? African-American and Hmong. So I think it's really wonderful. And that's the reason why I'm doing research. I'm encouraging my students to do research on these delegates because they've done amazing things in their lives, but we just don't know very much about these particular women. I think there's a tendency to celebrate people who do well within the existing system. But these women are really trying to advocate for social change, and to celebrate that and to recognize that, I think is really important, especially given the fact that Asian Americans are often seen as model minorities, that they don't protest. I'm sure that Suni Lee and her team and the US media, they'll do plenty of promotion, I think, for her. But I think it's more important to bring attention to the communities that don't have that type of access, right? That don't have the ability to influence public media, mainstream media, right? How can we amplify and support those voices?
Okay, thank you.
So this is Lynn, and I have a question about, does the Women's Conference happen every 10 years now, or is it an annual event? No.
So this is one of the big disappointments. So after this conference, the report was given to the US Congress and to President Jimmy Carter, but he received it at a time when there was a much more conservative political trend that was happening. And he himself was a little bit ambivalent. He's from the South. He was opposed to abortion, even though he's in the Democratic Party. And so he wasn't that enthusiastic and supportive. When I started doing research on this conference in 2017, that was the 40th anniversary of the conference. And I had a group of students who were helping me work on the research. They looked at the 27 issues and they said, all these issues are still here, right? None of them have been resolved. Right? We still have a wage disparity between men and women, right? So media representation, healthcare, all these issues are still with us. And I think it's important to think about the long-term ramifications for the conference. For the women who participated, it was an incredibly inspirational event, and they came back with more energy and had kind of political contacts with each other. But in terms of making legislative headway, it's still an ongoing process. So the women who came back, they formed their own network. And that's why I became interested in this conference. For the Asian American Pacific Islander women who participated in 1977, in 1980, they held their own conferences. So that title of Asian American Women on the Move, they held conferences that with that title, although they had Asian Pacific American Women on the Move. And it was a very similar model. They had regional conferences like in Hawaii, Washington, California, Washington, DC, New York, and then they had a national conference. So I'm interested in kind of thinking about the reverberations of these gatherings. There were also other gatherings that were associated with the United Nations. So I think it was Denmark in 1980, I think it was Kenya in 1985, and then Beijing 1995. So I haven't gotten to that stage in my research, but there were definitely efforts by women to stay in connection with each other and to continue working on these issues.
Thank you.
Did anybody else?
Oh, and by the way, I was going to ask a question about the Black Lives Matters, the same question, but I think you pretty much addressed. In my mind is that I do observe when the last year, I think when it happened, and then so, no, actually this happened for a few years now, Black Lives Matter. And then I see some, even among Asian population, seems like there was a quick reaction about, oh, all life matters. But then I think about it, I actually feel that if we can be in the supportive role to support the movement, is ultimately benefit the Asians. So I was just trying to hear your opinion about it, and apparently have been discussed among the leadership. So yeah, the activists.
Yeah, I think the phrase all lives matters is interesting. Of course, we think all lives matter, but, or not of course, because not everybody agrees with that, but it seems like it's a liberal response to say all lives matter. But the reason why Black Lives Matter was chosen is that over and over again, there's a disregard for Black life. So thinking about the police killings, or thinking about the killings by people who are civilians, but they can get away with it. Or just thinking about the historical foundation of this country that's based in slavery, right? Slaves are not considered human beings. Their marriages were not recognized. They could not learn to read, right? So there's a tradition of the inhumanization of Black lives. And I think that's why that particular slogan is so powerful, and why the response, all lives matter, in some ways dismisses that unique experience. Uncle John, you had another question? Oh, I think you're muted. Oh, okay. I saw in the chat that someone knows Gloria Kumkai. That's wonderful. Yeah, Minnesota's really...
Oh, that was me.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So she was the principal of a school called Museum Magnet, I think. Was like 20 years ago. I used to work for Singapore Public Schools. Yeah, I didn't know, and she didn't mention anything about that. Nobody knows this history. So I'm so glad. This is just kind of such a coincidence that, and it's such a small world to me. Like, I would know about this side of her through you, who I never met you before too. So this is all thanks to our 华人学术研讨会.
Yeah, she's really nice and very supportive. I interviewed her, I think it was in 2017 or 2018. But just recently, I restarted this project because I was finishing the Patsy Mink book, and we had a reunion event. So Gloria was able to come to that. I think she came to that. And then other women who are just doing really amazing things. They're involved in like international development work, gender equity work. One person went on to be involved in the US Census, and she's retired and helped advocate for ethnic studies at San Francisco State. So each one of these people are just so remarkable. I'm so glad that you had a personal connection with her. It was really interesting because at the time I was working with students, and because I was in Minnesota, I could go to Gloria's house, but I wanted my student to take a leadership role. So we had our student, I think it was on either Skype or phone, call in to do the interview. And then I was there in person, so I could take pictures of Gloria and also ask her additional questions. So it was fun to be able to involve a younger generation of scholars.
So this is Lynn again. I have another question. So since 1977, from the first conference. How do you see women's movement or Asian American movement advances, kind of another highlight, a certain point or something that you can actually say, okay, that's definitely another turning point of the movement, or yeah.
Yeah, well, I think the historical assessment was something that was really needed, especially last year, because 2020 was the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. That was the US Constitution that it's often described as women's suffrage, so giving women the right to vote. And even though it was a constitutional amendment, not every woman did have the right to vote, even after it was ratified. So, for example, African-American women in the South, because of segregation, were not allowed to vote. And then if you were an Asian immigrant, you could not become a US citizen, not until 43 for Chinese Americans, not until 46 for some of the other groups, and not until 52 for Japanese. So even though it's a constitutional amendment, it doesn't necessarily apply to everybody equally. But I thought last year's election of Kamala Harris was incredibly historically important. She's African-American and South Asian American. You know, we've never had a female president, and there are other countries that elect women into the most important political position in their countries, but not in the United States. That has been a really significant gender barrier. And so for her to become a vice president as a woman of color, as someone who's a multiracial Asian American, is pretty significant. But I think even when we have people in political positions of leadership, it's really important to mobilize at the grassroots or at the community level, right? Because they can only make a certain amount of change, even when they're at the top. There has to be kind of political momentum, political support, that they recognize that they're representing a constituency. And so I think that is also very important. I mean, last year was also, actually it was this year. This year was also particularly devastating, not in terms of progress, but in terms of violence. So we think about COVID-19 and the ways in which Chinese people are blamed for the virus, right? Using the term China virus or Kung flu. And then you see the attacks against Asian American women, especially in places like Atlanta, that it's really important to think about the long lasting and kind of very stubborn culture that regards Asian people as foreign, as lesser than, and especially women as somehow even worse, right? So they're both ostracized based on race, and they're ostracized based on gender, sort of disregard for them. So even though we have someone like Kamala Harris elected, it's also in contrast to events like Atlanta. So I think it's important to not just always think about progress, but think about what remains to be done. There was an interesting comment in the chat about the Hmong community in Minnesota and how it's very cohesive compared to, I don't know if the comparison is to Chinese American communities. I don't know if you wanted to say a little bit more about that. Uncle John, are you trying to speak? You're on mute.
John, you are on mute.
Okay. Actually, I based on what I know, the Hmong we have about close to 100,000 population in Minnesota, but according to census, only about 27,000. But I think in recent decade, this was done 10 years ago, it was 27,000. But in reality, I know when they're during the Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year, they had a celebration in the city center auditorium. They are closer to 100 participate. Maybe they come from neighborhood. And then the other largest minority is Somalia minority. So those two, they each one close to about 100,000 population in Minnesota. Whereas Chinese in general, I would think about 20 to 30,000. So it's very small compared with Hmong. Hmong has their own schools and have their own academy, teach them to go to colleges, and they create their own scholarship and so on. So they work very, very hard to help the Asian, the Hmong American to grow in Minnesota. So each ethnic group has to do something for their own. And I don't mean Asian American, we have many organizations, maybe a dozen or so, but most of them are pretty fragmented, not as cohesive as Hmong America in Minnesota. I think very much the same in many parts of the metropolitan area. Yeah, just for your information. It's a very large population. Yeah. This Lee, this Olympic gold medalist, he come from a very, very poor family. So the whole family had to support her to get through this exercise. And I'm not so sure how much financial assistance she gets from the community. I'm not so sure, but it was a very great achievement for them and for Asian American.
Well, thank you so much, Uncle John. I know at UC Irvine, we're close to Little Saigon. So that's the largest Vietnamese community outside of Vietnam. And a lot of our students are from Southeast Asia. And if you look at sort of socioeconomic statistics overall, which are somewhat deceptive, right? Because there's a need to disaggregate, but also to think about class differences within each group. But overall, Southeast Asian communities tend to have lower kind of educational achievements, kind of financial security. And so it's really wonderful to know that people in the community are trying to support each other and to support their youth so that they can have these opportunities. I wonder if there are ways in which Asian American organizations might come together and find commonalities. I mentioned before the model that we have in Orange County where we get together once a month. And I learn a lot from people in the community. So for example, the concerns about the US Census and the impact it has on legislative apportionment, delegation, the giving of resources like for schools and social services. And it really helps me understand what I think are the diverse needs of the community, that we're not all college educated professionals, but there are people who really need more support and to have people advocate for their needs. So I don't know if it's possible within Minnesota for people to come together more regularly and discuss ways in which they might collaborate with each other. Are there any other questions or comments? Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to connect with you and to share my research. I will let you all know what happens. I'm working on this particular book. Thank you so much again for the invitation to talk to all of you. And thank you, Deborah. I hope you feel better.
Thank you so much. We learned so much from you, and then I'm hoping that actually I had my final thought, but I thought, okay, we are done. But I think about the recognition of equity issue will be something that it just happened this couple of years. And then so leadership and then recognizing within the community, having different kind of social equity or just all kind of health equity. For example, I think what you have been talking kind of relate to our awareness of make sure that we just look around. There are disparity everywhere, and then supporting each other is something that can make this world a lot more nicer for everybody. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. It's been inspiring to see Asian American corporate leaders come together and say, we want to support different initiatives that help change the racial conversation in this country, that we want to have a more socially just world. And I think, many of us are in a position to do that maybe we've worked really hard. We've, kind of overcome many obstacles, maybe for ourselves and our families. But I think to then think about what we can do for the broader community, whether it's our ethnic community or the community in which we live in.